Welcome to the Lighthouse Baptist Church Sermon Podcast. Join us today as we look into God's Word. We do cordially invite you to join us next week in person. Our physical and mailing address is 817 U.S. Highway 280 West, Plains, Georgia 31780. We'd love to hear from you too. If you'd like to write, you can write us at that address, or you can email pastor@lighthouseswga.com. We hope you have your notebook ready. Now, here's today's message.
Philippians chapter number 4. I read this very quickly this morning, and it's still, I can't get away from it. It says in verse number 8, "Finally, my brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things." As I began to think about this, it was specifically the word praise there at the end of verse number 8. And as I began to look at this, to me at least, and I look at these things, and I'm no scholar or anything, but I look at these things, and just the way that it's written tends to intrigue me. It's very repetitive in its words, and then it not only is repetitive, but he ends it with two different phrases. Instead of saying whatsoever things are of virtue and whatsoever things are praised, think on these things. And that intrigues me. And so I began to look at this phrase about praise. If there be any praise, think on these things. And it could be the reason why I've been so intrigued with this is because I have told you that I have struggled with the problem of being critical. And I do believe that it is a problem. And there was a time, and I still, at my core, there is something that I had to learn a long time ago, is don't take everyone else's opinion about someone. Learn about them. And so that's still intact, that's still true. But if I'm not careful, at a moment's notice, first glance, I will be very critical. I hear something that's just not right, and I'm like, oh, cool, that sounds horrible. Or why do they dress like that? Let's go back to this morning. Did they not examine themselves before they walked out of the house this morning? I'll say things like that, and most of the time to myself, but unfortunately sometimes it comes out. And so I say that to kind of preface this. When he says, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things. Kurt, what he's saying is, and I'm going to go back to some of these previous verses, but I had to clarify this for myself. He says, if there's anything praiseworthy, think on these things. So as I began to look at this, I began to look at that critical spirit. And if we're not careful, we critique everyone and we critique everything. We become critical and we overlook the good things. We see the way maybe someone is dressed as opposed to everyone else, and we are critical about that, but we forget about the good. And Paul says, if there be any praise, think on these things. If there be anything that is praiseworthy, think on this. And so I was convicted in my own heart because I so often overlook the good things in people because I see the bad things and I focus on those. I just sitting back here, I got to thinking over in chapter number 2, in verse number 5, he says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. And again, Brother David sitting right back here became convicted because the things that these critical things that I let infiltrate my own mind, I know they weren't from Christ because I know their lyrics to a song, but I believe He looked through time and He saw me and He said, I'm still going to die for Him. I do believe that while He was on the cross, I was on His mind. And so if He looked through time and He saw me and still died for me, then surely I should let that type of attitude and mind be in me. And I don't have notes. I'm just kind of sharing with you with my heart because I can't get away from it. The previous verses, he's dealing with the mind. He's dealing with some things, and he says in verse number 4, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. I've given this to you before, but this word always is every when. It doesn't matter what it is. Every when, rejoice. That's not language that we use. But when you are discouraged, rejoice in the Lord. When you are in a battle, rejoice in the Lord. When you are on the mountain, rejoice in the Lord. Every when, every circumstance, everything, rejoice in the Lord. But then he says, let your moderation be known unto all men. And this again, very peculiar, the Lord is at hand. And I've said this before, that if we would start living like the Lord could come back any time now, we would be living pretty clean lives. But yet, I become critical. And I begin to say, well, they don't look like me, or they don't walk like me, or they don't do this, or their standards are not like me. Y'all get what I'm saying here? I don't even know if I'm talking just to myself or not. But I tend to forget that even though I'm ready to meet the Lord, there's some things that I ought to be ashamed of in my life. And that's that critical spirit. We see people every day that have less than we do. We see people every day that's been through so many more things than we have, but yet they're still living and they're still breathing. And I lose sight that if it were not for the grace of God, I may be where they are. My heart at the jail last Saturday broke as I saw black men and white men. I saw young and I saw old. I saw some that as clean cut as you can be in the jail, they were clean cut. And then there were some that they weren't as well kempt as others. But they were there. And I had but one thing to give them, Jody. I couldn't give them money. I couldn't give them anything but what I had. And my heart went over to what, was it, I don't even remember, I won't say Paul and Silas, but I think it was Peter and John. Y'all help me. But somebody came up to him and they were begging alms, and they said, silver and gold have I none, but such as I have give I unto thee. And I thought, these men probably could handle a $20 bill, or maybe new clothes, or a warm place to sleep when they get out. And I don't have any of those things, but what I do have is the gospel. And I was able to give them the gospel, and they received it. And I believe received it with their hearts. But then I get outside of the confines of that confine there, and then I see someone in freedom, but yet I don't give them what God's given me. And I begin to criticize because of this, that, or the other. My heart was pricked Because even in a time when I feel like I feel, and I'm not bragging, but I feel like I'm closer to the Lord now than ever, and I'm not prideful in saying that. I'm humbled in saying that, but then something as simple as looking at somebody with a critical heart, just like that. A month or so ago, right here, God pricked my heart and made me apologize to an individual before you and before God because pride snuck up in my soul. And I said something I shouldn't have said. I'm not above sin. You're not above sin. He says, rejoice every win. But He says, you need to remember that the Lord is at hand. When you see that one they don't have, remember that the Lord is at hand. When you see that one that is not like you, remember that God could come anytime. When there are obstacles and there are opportunities to become critical, to become judgmental, be very careful. I believe it's book of Hebrews, maybe chapter number 11, could be chapter 4, or one of the other ones, I don't remember. It says that you've entertained angels unaware. I don't know the depth of that, Brother David, but I just wonder, maybe some of those customers or some of those boys that you work with, they come to you, and I know it's got to be aggravating to deal with the same thing over and over again, but it could be that God sent one of them by just to see how you would act or react to them. I don't know where I'm going with this. Verse number 6 says, be careful for nothing. We've tried to define that all we know how to do, and we say that word careful is anxious. Don't be anxious. Be careful for nothing. But in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. And this hit me so hard yesterday. Because verse number 7, we use this as a standalone verse, and I'm not criticizing that at all. But verse number 7, and the peace of God which passeth all understanding shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. And I think it can be a standalone, but as I look at it today, it almost, Brother Kenny, seems to be a very provisional promise. A conditional promise, if you will. And so to get this peace of God that He promised there in verse number 7, you've got to make sure to follow through with verse number 6. Be careful. If you want peace, if you want freedom from anxiety, He says, in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. If you're anything like me, I got my anxiety from my mama and from my wife. But if you're anything like me, it's at night. It's early in the morning when that anxiety hits me. Sometimes it's broad daylight when I'm all by myself. And anxiety hits me and I begin to second guess. And I begin to question. I begin to wonder if I'm good enough. I begin to wonder. We'd all be depressed if I begin to tell you all the things that I wonder. But I allow anxiety to grip me. But the reason, Kaylee, the reason that I'm not at peace with God is because I've not given it to God. Y'all help me. Let your request be made known unto God. How? By prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. And again, I don't have the depth of this. But I think that we are missing out on the peace of God because we've not followed through from verse number 6. We've said, God, take this fear from me. We've said, God, take this anxiety from me, and there's nothing wrong with that. But have we truly prayed about the source of the anxiety? Have we, and I don't know if this is a word, but have we supplicated on behalf of that source of that anxiety? Have we thanked God through it? He just said to rejoice. He said to rejoice. Then He said that we should make let our moderation be known because the Lord is at hand. So could it be tonight, before we ever get to verse number 8, that we've truly got to conquer verse 6 and verse number 7 and allow the peace of God that He promised to overwhelm us after we've prayed and we've sought the Lord and we've thanked the Lord? I would love it. I would love it if one of these days y'all would sing that song. I just came here to talk to you, Lord. Oh my goodness. Don't know much about Dottie Rambo, but when she wrote it, she sure had something to say. I didn't come here for anything, Lord. I just came to talk to you. In those times, when I'm in the living room, the lights are off, the family's in bed, and I'm sitting up. It's not for my health. As some would say, it's because my mind won't shut off. That's part of it. The other is because that anxiety is welling up. And sometimes, what helps me, Brother Kurt, and I think I'm being honest here, sometimes there's nothing for me to pray about. So I don't have to worry about my prayer and supplication. But sometimes I begin to thank God. Brother David, I thank God for things that I've not thought about. I thank God for things that have happened in the day. I thank God for delivering me from this. I thank God for doing. I thank God for being. Yesterday I was reminded, it seems like so often the psalmist tells his people to not just thank God for what He's done, but to thank God for who He is. There's times in the dark that I'm reminded of who He is. Then tonight again, you may leave tonight and you say, what was that? And that's okay, because I will leave tonight saying the exact same thing. But then you get to verse number 8. And he says, finally. Oh my God. And he uses this statement. And I wonder if he's not talking about all those things that we've been careful about, that we've been anxious about. And I'm a very visual person, so I imagine all of my problems laid out in a line. And I wonder if Paul's not writing to this church at Philippi, and he loves this church. And he's saying, brethren, he said, all those things that you're worried about, he said, I need you to find the things that are true. Don't focus on the lies. I need you to find the things that are honest. I need you to find those things that are just. They're right. I need you to find those things that are pure. Those things that are lovely and those things that are of good report. I can imagine if we could hear maybe the heartbeat of Paul. He's saying, don't let the lies of your circumstances and don't let the hurt from the past and don't let the unrighteousness that you've had to endure give you the anxiety. He says, I need you to think of all of the things that you're worried about and all the things that you're dealing with. He says, think of those things and see if you can find any virtue. See if you can find any purity in those things. He said, when you find those things that have that purity, He says, I want you to look a little bit deeper. And He said, see if there's anything that's praiseworthy. And He said, when you figure all those things out and you've got all your worries lined up, but then you've got all these other things, like these blessings and these benefits lined up, He said, think on these things. Don't think on those things, but think on these things. These things that are honoring to God. These things that give you peace. These things that are just, these things that bring glory and bring honor to the holiness and to the majesty of God. He says, I want you to think about these things. And every one of us could make a list of those things that worry us. But Paul's given us a list that we can write down and we can put in our pocket. And we can compare everything that makes us tremble and fear inside, and we can weigh it against those things that are just and pure and true and honest and lovely and of a good report. And in those things we can find virtue and we can find praise. And then see what is happening is our mind is then focused on the good things of God. Samuel, you said it this morning. I forgot the phrase that you said right there at the end. But you were talking about our vision. Looking to Jesus. Getting our minds off of everything else and focusing on Him. I ask you tonight. I just got to read verse number 9. Those things which ye have both learned and received and heard and seen in me, do. And the God of peace shall be with you. Paul wasn't perfect. He said on your next page, he says, I've not attained. He said, I've not apprehended. I'm not perfect. I got growing to do. He said, but I've told you what's true. He said, so everything that you've heard, you've learned, you received, you've seen in me. He said, do those things. I've not led you astray. Do those things. Then He says, and the God of peace shall be with you. Isn't it funny that verse number 7 says, and the peace of God shall keep your hearts? But now He says, and the God of peace shall be with you. Oh, that's two separate messages right there. There is the peace of God. And that's good to sustain you and to comfort you. But when the God of peace comes down, that's a whole other thing.